Good day, friends. I am here to talk to you about the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts were nicknamed the Intolerable Acts by colonists, and you'll find out in a moment why the Coercive Acts were also known as the Intolerable Acts. When news of the Boston Tea Party finally crossed the Atlantic and reached Great Britain, government leaders were furious. These rebellious colonists must be punished. So in 1774, Parliament created a series of laws called the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts were designed for punishment. They wanted to punish Boston and the entire colony of Massachusetts for the destruction of the tea and the ongoing rebellion that was occurring in that colony. These laws were so very hated by colonists that they became known as the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable means you cannot stand something. Something is so terrible you cannot tolerate it. That's why the Coercive Acts were named the Intolerable Acts. One part of the Coercive Acts said that Boston Harbor had to remain closed until Bostonians paid for the tea that was destroyed. So British warships formed a blockade. That means they anchored themselves in a formation to block any ship from entering Boston Harbor. This closure was devastating to the economy of Boston. Ships could not come in to unload their goods, and ships were not able to take goods from Boston elsewhere because they couldn't get out of the harbor. So it was devastating to merchants, to farmers, to anyone who needed goods shipped in from outside of Boston or needed goods shipped out or exported from Boston. Another part of the Coercive Acts was the loss of political power and decision-making. Boston was placed under British military rule, and colonists were not allowed to make their own laws. Another part of the Coercive Acts concerned town meetings. And this wouldn't have necessarily impacted Boston, but it severely limited the decision-making power and the lawmaking power of the towns around Boston. In small New England towns, the town meeting system of government was where every eligible man in the town would gather at the meeting house, and together they would make rules and laws for their town. And under the Coercive Acts, town meetings were very limited or they were canceled altogether. So this was devastating to the towns around Boston. Another part of the Coercive Acts was called the Quartering Act. And this was very frustrating and distressing for colonists. British soldiers took up residence in homes, outbuildings, taverns, any other structures that they could live in, like boarding houses. The British soldiers would live in structures around Boston. So instead of the British soldiers just patrolling the town and then going to sleep at barracks far away at night, they were actually living in and among the Bostonians. And as you can imagine, the people of Boston hated British soldiers living in their town. They felt like they were being constantly watched and monitored. And to make matters worse, they were even expected to pay for the soldiers' food and drinks and even firewood. So the Quartering Act, I'll give you a little preview when you talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Quartering Act was actually the basis for the Third Amendment to the Constitution. When British Prime Minister Lord North was asked why he supported these harsh coercive acts, here's his response. He said, "Whatever may be the consequences, so whatever ends up happening, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." So he's saying that imposing these harsh coercive acts might lead to more conflict with the American colonies. But he was okay with that. He said that doing nothing was a bigger risk, because if they did nothing after Bostonians destroyed the tea and after all of the rebellion happening in the colonies, if they just let it go and did nothing, then the colonies are never going to take Parliament seriously, and they're never going to respect Great Britain's authority. The Coercive Acts were used to tighten control over the colonies, especially Massachusetts. British leaders hoped that these harsh Coercive Acts would put an end to the colonial rebellion. What do you think happened? Do you think the colonists said, hey, these Coercive Acts are terrible, we hate them, we want Great Britain to lift these terrible laws off of us, so we're going to start behaving? We are going to stop the rebellion, and we are going to be on our best behavior. Do you think that's what happened? Do you think that the colonists changed their behavior because they hated the Coercive Acts? Well, let's find out what actually happened. To the dismay of British leaders, the Coercive Acts actually had the opposite effect in colonial America. Parliament hoped to squash the rebellion in Massachusetts and in Boston. They wanted to make an example of what happened when you dared to defy Great Britain. But they were not successful. The colonies pulled together to support Massachusetts and to continue their defiance of British law. Today, we celebrate the Boston Tea Party as a brave act of rebellion against unfair laws. But there were many important colonists, including George Washington and Ben Franklin, who were not convinced that destroying the tea was the best course of action. In a letter from June 1774, so this was about 6 months after the Boston Tea Party, George Washington stated this opinion about Boston Tea Party participants. He said, not that we approve their conduct in destroying the tea. So he didn't really approve of what the Sons of Liberty had done during the Boston Tea Party. And you might say, hey, lady, you have some typos here. Well, this is actually 18th century text. This is George Washington's actual words. I copied this directly from his letter. This UC was added later, probably by a historian, because George Washington spelled conduct, C-O-N-D-T. So someone added this UC so that we could tell that the word was conduct. And then he forgot the I-N in destroying. So this is actual 18th century text. We don't have standardized spellings that, we today use standardized spellings from the dictionary. They didn't have that back in the 18th century. So they just wrote things as they sounded. So this is actually, his spelling and his words. In February of 1774, Ben Franklin was actually in London representing the interests of the colonies. This excerpt is from a letter that he wrote to Boston patriots who were fully aware of what happened during the Boston Tea Party and fully supported it. These patriots included Sam Adams and John Hancock. He was pretty concerned that destroying the private property of the East India Company, the tea, after all, was private property of the East India Company. He was worried that this destruction reflected poorly on the colony's reputation. He thought that the colonies should pay for the destroyed tea. Here are his words that he wrote. I am truly concerned that there should seem to any a necessity for carrying matters to such extremity. So I'm actually concerned, guys, that anyone would think it was necessary to take such extreme measures. In a dispute about public rights, so in a dispute with Great Britain about taxation without representation, You guys have destroyed private property. As the East India Company, however, are not our adversaries, so the East India Company, they're not our enemies. They didn't ship the tea to the colonies. Parliament had them ship the tea to the colonies. And just a side note, remember, lots of members of Parliament actually owned stock in the East India Company, and they were trying to financially help this East India Company to help themselves make money. So giving the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, that was the doing of Parliament. That's what Benjamin Franklin is saying. We should not have destroyed the private property of the East India Company. The offensive measure of sending their teas did not take its rise with them. So he's saying the East India Company, they didn't send their tea. It wasn't their fault. It was Parliament's fault. A speedy reparation, so payback, a speedy payback, will immediately set us right in the opinion of all Europe. So he's saying all of Europe, so Great Britain, London, France, they're all going to look at us more kindly if we repay this private property that was destroyed in Boston. So although there were many colonists at the time who believed that destroying the tea was wrong and that Bostonians should pay for the tea, the other 12 colonies actually united together with Massachusetts to oppose the Coercive Acts and Great Britain's harsh treatment. People across the colonies were angry and appalled at how severe the Coercive Acts were, and they thought this brutal treatment that was being imposed on Boston and on all of Massachusetts could actually come to our colonies. These harsh rules could be imposed on all of our colonies. In essence, Parliament's plan backfired. Colonists continued to boycott and protest, but now they were even more resolved, and the matter was more urgent because they didn't want what happened in Boston, the severe coercive acts, the intolerable acts. They didn't want those laws to stretch to their colonies. And so the patriots all across the 13 colonies supported Massachusetts and supported their fight to end the unfair treatment that was being imposed by Great Britain. I hope that you've learned a little bit about the Coercive Acts, and I hope that you will dive in and learn more details and more interesting things that happened during the Coercive Acts and the colonies' reaction to the Coercive Acts and how it led to the American Revolution.